In his Georgia neighborhood, Reginald Thompson was the kind of man people pointed to as an example of how life should be lived. At 38 years old, Reginald carried himself with the confidence and structure of his past military life. A former Marine, he had transitioned into the growing world of information technology, securing a stable position that offered both financial security and professional respect. His background gave him discipline, and his career gave him prestige. Neighbors often noted that he was the sort of man who seemed to have it all figured out. A devoted father, a reliable husband, and a steady presence in his community. At home, Reginald's life appeared to revolve around his family. His wife, Shironda Thompson, had been with him for over a decade. Friends described her as warm, approachable, and deeply involved in their daughter's school and social activities. Together, they presented the picture of a solid, middle-class black family building their version of the American dream. There were cookouts in the summer, holiday gatherings at their house, and consistent Sunday appearances at church. If outsiders looked in, they would see a household defined by order and love. The Thompsons' pride and joy was their daughter, Michaela, a sharp and observant 10-year-old. Teachers praised her for her attentiveness and her polite nature. Reginald in particular was known to dote on her, never missing parent-teacher meetings and making time, despite his work schedule, to help with school projects or cheer from the sidelines of youth events. To those who saw the family interact, Michaela was the glue that made their bond visible. Reginald spoke of her with pride, telling colleagues she was destined for great things. From the outside looking in, the Thompsons represented something many people admired, a family that had weathered years together without scandal or disruption. Friends considered them dependable. Their daughter seemed happy, and their home life looked secure. It is this image, the model father, the committed wife, the bright child, that makes what followed so unsettling. And while Reginald Thompson was known as the man who had everything under control, what no one could see was how tightly controlled appearances can sometimes mask the most dangerous fractures of all. While Reginald Thompson was admired for his discipline and steadiness, his wife Shironda Thompson was quietly slipping into choices that would dismantle everything they had built. In early 2023, Shironda reconnected with an old acquaintance, Calvin Rhodes, a man she had known from years earlier. At first, it was nothing more than a casual reconnection, a friendly message exchanged after bumping into each other at a local event. Calvin was charismatic, easy to talk to, and he quickly began to fill an emotional gap Shironda felt had grown in her marriage. Reginald's long hours in the IT field, combined with his lingering military habits of rigid structure and reserve, had left Shironda feeling unattended. She still had her husband's respect, but not his consistent attention. Calvin, on the other hand, gave her compliments, sent her late-night texts, and reminded her of the carefree energy of her younger years. What began with innocent conversations turned into coffee meetups. Those meetups became lunches. And lunches, in time, became quiet encounters where lines blurred. Shironda convinced herself she could handle it. Calvin wasn't part of her daily world. He lived across town, he had his own routines, and their meetings could be concealed. She rationalized that Reginald was unlikely to ever suspect her. She was still running their household, still attending Michaela's school events, still presenting herself as the loyal wife to the outside world. To friends, nothing about Shironda seemed out of place. But privately, she had already stepped across the line from loyalty to betrayal. Calvin Rhodes didn't push for more than Shironda offered, but he welcomed every opportunity she gave him. Their relationship was not just physical. It was the secrecy that fueled it. The thrill of hiding texts, of slipping away with excuses, gave Shironda a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. And yet, she underestimated the risk she was taking. Like many who believe they can manage a double life, she convinced herself that what Reginald didn't know wouldn't hurt him. But secrets in families rarely stay hidden forever. By mid-2023, Shironda's affair was firmly in motion, existing parallel to the life she shared with her husband and daughter. She thought she was careful. She thought she was in control. What she didn't realize was that the decisions she was making would soon collide with the sharp eyes of her 10-year-old daughter, and that collision would set in motion a chain of events no one in the Thompson household could ever undo. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Shironda Thompson decided to take her daughter, Michaela, out for a routine shopping trip. To anyone watching, it looked like the kind of ordinary mother-daughter outing that was part of their weekend rhythm. But Shironda had another reason for the trip. She had arranged to meet Calvin Rhodes nearby, planning to slip away for a few minutes under the cover of errands. After pulling into the lot of a department store on the edge of town, Shironda parked the car and told Michaela to stay inside while she met a friend quickly. Michaela, just 10 years old, was used to listening to her mother. But she was also unusually sharp, curious, and observant, traits that Reginald had encouraged in her from an early age. Something about her mother's hurried tone made her pay attention. From the car window, Michaela saw her mother walk toward a man waiting near the storefront. She recognized immediately that this wasn't one of the family's usual friends. Shironda greeted him closely, their conversation slipping quickly into familiarity. Within moments, Michaela watched as her mother leaned in, and the two shared an embrace that ended in a kiss. Michaela's young mind processed what she was seeing with a mix of confusion and instinct. She knew it wasn't something her father was supposed to see, and she knew her mother had asked her to stay in the car for a reason. Acting on the training of always telling the truth that Reginald had instilled in her, she quietly reached for the tablet resting in her lap. Holding it steady, she began to record through the window. The short clip captured more than she realized, not only the embrace, but many rounds of deep kisses like someone who has been starved of a good French kiss for decades. The moment lasted only minutes. Shironda soon returned to the car, her tone casual as though nothing had happened. She asked Michaela if she was ready to go inside. To Shironda, it was just another secret meeting managed smoothly. To Michaela, it was the moment when her view of her mother, and of her family, shifted. She didn't speak of it then. She didn't confront her mother or ask questions. But she carried with her both the memory of what she saw and the evidence now stored on her tablet. That recording would not remain private for long. And for the Thompsons, what a 10-year-old captured in a quiet parking lot would become the spark that unraveled everything. For days after that shopping trip, 10-year-old Michaela Thompson carried a weight far beyond her years. What she had seen, her mother in the arms of another man, gnawed at her every time she looked at her parents together at the dinner table or heard her father's steady voice checking in on her homework. She loved both of them deeply, but the secret she now held felt impossible to keep. She was too young to confront her mother, and the thought of looking her father in the eye and telling him outright was unbearable. Michaela thought carefully about how to let her father know without betraying her mother to her face. After several sleepless nights, she took a sheet of paper from her school notebook and wrote out the truth in her uneven but determined handwriting. The words were short, almost childlike, but heavy in meaning. "Daddy, I'm sorry, but I have to tell you. I saw Mommy with another man. I took a video on my tablet to show you. Please don't tell her I told you. I love you." She folded the note neatly and waited until the right moment. One evening, when Reginald left his wallet on the kitchen counter, Michaela slipped the folded paper inside, placing it between the bills where she knew he would find it eventually. She said nothing. She carried herself as normal, masking the storm of emotions with the composure of a child who had learned to be cautious. 2 days later, while on his lunch break at work, Reginald opened his wallet at a sandwich shop. Alongside the cash, he noticed the folded sheet of lined paper. Recognizing his daughter's handwriting, he unfolded it and began to read. In the middle of his ordinary day, surrounded by the hum of conversation and clatter of trays, Reginald's world stopped. The words cut into him with a force no one else in that room could see. His wife, the woman he trusted, accused by their own daughter of betrayal. And proof, apparently, waiting at home. He stared at the note for a long time, holding it tightly in his hands. From that moment forward, nothing in his life would feel the same again. That evening, after returning home from work, Reginald Thompson carried himself with the same quiet composure his family was used to seeing. To Shironda, nothing seemed unusual. But tucked in his pocket was the folded note he had found at lunch, his daughter's words weighing on him heavier than anything he had experienced since leaving the Marine Corps. When the chance came, Reginald asked Michaela if she could step into her room with him. His tone was calm, careful, the same voice he often used when helping her with schoolwork. Michaela, relieved that her secret was finally out, nodded and reached for her tablet. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing play. On the screen, Reginald saw his wife standing in the parking lot with Calvin Rhodes. The footage was shaky, captured through the car window by small hands, but the scene was unmistakable. Shironda leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones. He'd later tell police that the clip had too many kissing scenes for a 10-year-old. Reginald watched in silence. His face didn't move, but his body stiffened as though absorbing a blow. For 12 years, he had believed his household rested on loyalty and discipline. Now, in seconds, the image of the devoted wife was stripped away before his eyes. And the proof came not from rumor or suspicion, but from his daughter, the child he trusted most. Michaela looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, unsure if she had done the right thing. Reginald placed his hand on her shoulder and told her softly that she had. He reassured her that she was not in trouble, that she had only told the truth. Outwardly, he gave her calm. Inwardly, his world was splitting apart. There were no loud words that night, no confrontations with Shironda. Reginald carried the knowledge in silence, but inside, something had shifted permanently. The foundation of his marriage was no longer just cracked, it was broken. And in that silence, a darker seed began to take root. In the days that followed, Reginald Thompson moved through his home like a man balancing on a thin wire. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still sat at the dinner table, still asked Michaela about her school day, still exchanged words with Shironda in the quiet rhythm of married life. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was racing. The video his daughter had shown him replayed over and over, not just as proof of betrayal in the present, but as a key to questions he had never dared to ask before. As he turned the situation over in his head, Reginald began to connect timelines. He thought back to the early months of his marriage, to the period when Shironda had spent more time visiting friends from her past. That was the same year she became pregnant with Michaela. Until now, he had never doubted his role as a father. He had been there for the birth, changed diapers, guided first steps, and built a bond that felt unshakable. But now, with evidence of Shironda's infidelity staring him down, a darker possibility emerged. Could Michaela have never been his child at all? Reginald couldn't ignore the thought. The idea grew stronger with each passing day, eating away at the certainty he had once lived by. He needed an answer, and he needed it without Shironda ever knowing. Quietly, he collected a hair sample from Michaela's brush and packaged it carefully. With the discipline of a man trained to prepare without error, he arranged for a private lab to process a paternity test, paying extra for expedited results. The waiting was suffocating. At work, he sat at his desk but accomplished little. At home, he masked his distraction with clipped conversations and long silences that Shironda dismissed as stress from the job. Only Michaela noticed her father's gaze lingering on her, as if he was searching for something in her face that he could no longer find in himself. Several days later, the results arrived. Reginald read the report alone, and the conclusion was unambiguous. He was not Michaela's biological father. In that moment, the betrayal multiplied. It was no longer just about Shironda's current affair with Calvin Rhodes. It was about a decade of deception, a decade of raising a child under false pretenses, a decade of loyalty built on a lie. Reginald did not speak of it to anyone. He didn't storm into the living room to confront Shironda, and he didn't break down in front of his daughter. But internally, something hardened. What he had once seen as his family now felt, in his mind, like a fabrication. The man who had built his life on trust and discipline now carried a truth that tore both apart. And from that truth, his anger deepened into something colder, a sense of humiliation that would not let him go. After the DNA results confirmed his worst fear, Reginald Thompson became a man living two lives. To the outside world, he was still the same dependable father and husband, the ex-Marine who went to work in the mornings, paid the bills on time, and helped his daughter with her homework in the evenings. He kept up the facade with careful precision, never raising suspicion that anything in the Thompson home had changed. But behind the mask of normalcy, humiliation and betrayal were tearing him apart. In his mind, the past 12 years had been rewritten. Every moment with Michaela, her first steps, her birthdays, the school awards he had framed, now felt like reminders of a lie. What had once been a source of pride had turned into a symbol of deception. He told himself that Shironda had not only broken their marriage but had robbed him of his very identity as a father. That betrayal in his eyes was unforgivable. Reginald's military background had taught him discipline, but it had also ingrained in him the belief that trust and loyalty were non-negotiable. To discover that both had been violated at the core of his home pushed him toward a mindset that criminologists often call self-righteous annihilation, the belief that his partner had destroyed the family, and that punishing her, even destroying the family entirely, was a justified act. Reginald never said these thoughts out loud, but in silence he replayed them again and again, convincing himself that he had been pushed into a corner by Shironda's choices. Around Shironda he remained composed. He still offered nods of acknowledgement, still joined her for meals, still lay beside her at night without a word of what he knew. But his silence was no longer the calm of a steady man. It was the silence of someone withdrawing, calculating, and nursing a wound that festered. Shironda, caught up in her own guilt and distractions, mistook his detachment for work-related stress. She had no idea that Reginald's thoughts had already shifted from betrayal to retribution. Even Michaela, the daughter who had once been his pride, was no longer spared in his thinking. Though he never treated her unkindly in those weeks, the results of the DNA test had changed the way he saw her. In his mind, she was living proof of Shironda's lies. The innocence of a child was overshadowed by the stain of a secret Shironda had kept from him for a decade. Instead of separating Shironda's actions from Michaela's existence, Reginald began to see both as part of the same deception. Inside, Reginald was changing. The man who had built his reputation as a steady protector was gone. In his place was a man consumed by humiliation, determined not to be remembered as the one deceived. He masked it carefully, but his mind was already sliding down a path where punishment and destruction felt like the only answers left. With his mind fixed on betrayal and humiliation, Reginald Thompson began to craft a plan that would allow him to act without raising suspicion. Confronting Shironda directly risked exposure, arguments, and perhaps her leaving him before he could decide what to do. He needed control, and to have that control, he needed isolation. The idea came to him as something that would look innocent on the surface, a family vacation. At the dinner table one evening, Reginald suggested the trip casually, framing it as a way to celebrate their upcoming anniversary and to spend time together as a family. He spoke of relaxation, of getting away from the routines of work and school, and of giving Michaela a reward for finishing her school year strong. His delivery was measured, warm, and entirely believable. For Shironda, the offer felt like a gift. She had been carrying her own guilt quietly, and the chance to reconnect seemed like exactly what their marriage needed. She agreed without hesitation. Behind the scenes, Reginald worked out the details with the precision of someone planning an operation. He chose a lakeside resort cabin in North Carolina, far from their Georgia home and set apart from prying neighbors. The area promised quiet woods, wide water, and few interruptions. He booked the cabin under his name, paying deposits without mentioning much to anyone outside the family. To those who did know, he described it as a simple getaway. As the date approached, Reginald began to prepare in ways Shironda couldn't imagine. He packed clothes and personal items like any father would, but among them he placed tools meant for something far darker: duct tape, zip ties, a sharp hunting knife, and the 9mm pistol he had kept from his military years. He purchased a prepaid cell phone, a burner phone that could not easily be traced back to him. He moved through each step quietly, blending it with the normal tasks of preparing for a trip. Shironda noticed none of it. To her, the renewed attention from Reginald was a sign of hope. He smiled at her more, asked about the meals she was planning to make at the cabin, and even discussed possible fishing trips with Michaela. She believed she was being offered a chance to repair what she sensed had grown distant, unaware that her husband was carefully setting the stage for a trap. By the time the Thompsons loaded their SUV with bags and supplies, Reginald's plan was fully in place. To anyone watching, it was the image of a family heading out for time together. To Reginald, it was the beginning of the cover that would allow him to carry out what he had already decided in silence. The Thompsons' arrival at the lakeside resort cabin gave no sign of what was to come. The setting was serene, tall pines framing the water, quiet trails stretching for miles, and a cabin that stood just far enough from neighbors to feel private. For Shironda, it seemed like the kind of place where a strained marriage might find its footing again. For Michaela, it was an adventure, a break from school and routine. And for Reginald, it was the perfect environment to carry out what he had already resolved. The first 2 days unfolded without disruption. The family hiked the surrounding trails, cooked meals together, and sat by a fire pit roasting marshmallows. Shironda believed the trip was working. Reginald was calm, attentive, and even laughed when Michaela teased him about burning a marshmallow to ash. To her, it looked like healing. To him, it was preparation. He was waiting for the right moment. On the third morning, Reginald suggested something that seemed natural for a father and daughter: an early fishing trip on the lake. Shironda declined, saying she would stay behind to prepare breakfast. It was exactly the opportunity Reginald had been waiting for. He and Michaela walked down to the dock together, loaded into the small aluminum fishing boat he had rented, and pushed out onto the water. They drifted across the calm surface, the morning air quiet except for the hum of the motor. Michaela sat near the edge, legs swinging, excited about the idea of catching fish. To her, it was just another memory with her father. To Reginald, it was the moment he had planned in silence for weeks. At a remote corner of the lake, he cut the engine and let the boat rest in the stillness. What happened next was both swift and unrelenting. As Michaela leaned over the side, Reginald moved behind her, gripping her small frame with the strength of a trained Marine. In an instant, he forced her head beneath the water. She thrashed and struggled, but Reginald held her down firmly, his weight pressing until the fight weakened. Within minutes, the water stilled, and Michaela's life was gone. When it was over, Reginald pulled her back into the boat. He placed her body under a tarp he had packed among the fishing supplies, covering her carefully as if she were only gear to be hidden. He sat for several minutes in silence, staring across the lake. Then, without expression, he restarted the motor and steered the boat back toward the dock. Shironda was waiting at the cabin, unaware of what had just taken place on the water. To her, breakfast was ready and her family was returning for another day of vacation. She did not know that one seat at the table would never be filled again. When Reginald Thompson returned to the cabin that morning, his expression was as controlled as ever. He stepped through the door alone, leaving the boat tied to the dock with its grim cargo hidden beneath a tarp. Inside, Shironda was setting plates on the table, the smell of eggs and bacon filling the air. She smiled faintly and asked the question she thought was routine, "Where's Michaela?" Reginald didn't answer directly. He told her their daughter had fallen asleep under the shade in the boat, too tired from the early outing. He suggested they go down to the dock together to wake her. Shironda, unsuspecting and eager to share in what she thought was a tender father-daughter moment, agreed without hesitation. She walked beside him toward the lake, unaware that each step brought her closer to the violent truth. At the dock, Reginald's composure cracked. He turned to his wife and unleashed the words he had been carrying since discovering the note in his wallet and the DNA results in his hand. He accused her of betrayal, of lies that stretched back a decade, of deceiving him into raising a child that wasn't his. His voice was sharp, his anger controlled but deadly. Shironda froze, stunned, her face draining as she realized the depth of what he knew. She tried to speak, stumbling into pleas for forgiveness, insisting that she had only wanted to hold the family together, that she never meant to destroy what they had. Her words didn't matter. To Reginald, they were excuses. The rage and humiliation that had consumed him for weeks now demanded release. As Shironda begged, he pulled the hunting knife from his waistband. The pleas turned into screams as he drove the blade into her chest, again and again. Each thrust was fueled by the belief that she alone had ruined his life, that she had taken from him the identity of father and husband and left him with nothing but deceit. Shironda's resistance was brief but desperate. She clawed at his arms, leaving scratches down his skin, but she was no match for his strength. With one final slash across her throat, her cries fell silent. The dock, once a peaceful spot for fishing and lake views, was stained with her blood. Breathing heavily but without hesitation, Reginald dragged her body toward the boat. He pulled back the tarp that already concealed Michaela, placing Shironda's lifeless form alongside their daughter. He covered both again, hiding what he had done beneath the same sheet of canvas meant for fishing gear. For a moment he stood still, staring down at the boat, two bodies hidden under a single cover, the wife and child who had once been the center of his world, now reduced to evidence of betrayal and his violent response. The lake was silent around him, the morning sun climbing higher, the only witness to what had just unfolded. With both victims secured, Reginald prepared for the next phase of his plan, disposing of the bodies and creating the illusion of a disappearance that he believed would shield him from suspicion. With both Shironda and Michaela's bodies lying beneath the tarp in the boat, Reginald Thompson pushed off from the dock and steered toward a secluded cove on the far side of the lake. His movements were deliberate, shaped by the precision he had honed during years of military service. At the shoreline, he dragged each body out one at a time. Using large rocks gathered from the bank and sections of rope he had brought, he bound the weights to Shironda's ankles and Michaela's small frame. He lowered them into the water, watching until the ripples closed back over the surface. To any passerby, the cove looked undisturbed. To Reginald, it was the hiding place of his crimes. Returning to the cabin, he set about erasing signs of violence. He rinsed the blood from his hands, changed into clean clothes, and scrubbed the dock planks with lake water. The hunting knife he flung far into the water, sinking it beyond reach. He moved through these steps methodically, as if carrying out a checklist. When he was finished, he left the cabin looking untouched, as though the family had simply stepped out. By midday, Reginald drove the family SUV into the nearby town. He stopped at a gas station, purchasing snacks and drinks. The surveillance cameras captured him moving calmly through the store, establishing a time-stamped image of normal activity. To anyone reviewing the footage later, he would appear as nothing more than a man on vacation running errands. Shortly after returning, he made the call he had prepared for. Using the prepaid cell phone he had purchased weeks earlier, Reginald dialed the local sheriff's office. He reported his wife and daughter missing, his voice carrying the tone of a distressed husband. He claimed that while he was out fishing alone in the early hours, Shironda and Michaela must have left the cabin for a walk or hike and never returned. He pressed the urgency, saying he had searched the trails and found nothing. Deputies responded quickly, arriving at the cabin to begin the search. Reginald walked them through the story again, pointing to the woods nearby as the likely direction his wife and daughter had gone. He presented himself as worried but cooperative, answering questions without raising his voice. To the untrained eye, he looked like a man blindsided by a family disappearance. But investigators began noticing problems almost immediately. Shironda's purse and cell phone were still in the cabin, an odd detail for someone supposedly heading out on a walk. A deputy spotted faint traces of blood on the dock boards, despite Reginald's cleaning, and what looked like drag marks near the edge of the water. When questioned about fresh scratches on his forearms, Reginald explained them away as fishing accidents, but the explanation felt thin. By nightfall, suspicion was already forming. Search dogs were brought in, and they alerted strongly at the dock. The following morning, divers entered the lake. It did not take long. In the shaded cove, tethered by rope and weighted by rocks, they found Shironda's body. Michaela's was nearby. Her small frame carried a short distance from where her mother lay. The discovery ended any pretense of a disappearance. What had begun as a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. As deputies secured the scene and transported the bodies for autopsy, Reginald's carefully constructed cover began to unravel in full. The inconsistencies, the physical evidence, and the discovery in the lake all pointed directly back to him. He had planned for control. Instead, the control was slipping away with every new piece of evidence recovered. Once the bodies of Shironda and Michaela Thompson were pulled from the lake, the investigation into Reginald Thompson moved quickly. Deputies secured the cabin and his vehicle, combing through everything he had brought on the trip. In the back of the SUV they found zip ties, and used duct tape and evidence of rope matching what had been tied to the victims. At the cabin, small blood traces missed during his hurried cleaning were swabbed and confirmed to belong to Shironda. Back in Georgia, a search warrant for the Thompson home uncovered more damning material. On Reginald's laptop were recent internet searches that prosecutors would later highlight: how to weigh down a body in a lake, how long before a body resurfaces, and best states for gun carry while traveling. Tucked inside his wallet, investigators discovered the folded piece of notebook paper written in Michaela's small handwriting, the note where she confessed what she had seen and pleaded with her father not to tell her mother she had spoken. To detectives, it was a clear trigger. The innocent act of a child who trusted her father became the spark that pushed him to violence. Questioned at the sheriff's office, Reginald initially held to his story. He repeated that he had been fishing alone, and that when he returned, his wife and daughter were gone. But detectives confronted him with the mounting evidence: the scratches on his arms that matched Shironda's defensive wounds, the surveillance footage showing his calm demeanor at the gas station, and the inconsistencies in his timeline. When they revealed that divers had found both bodies and tied them directly to the dock where blood had been discovered, Reginald's composure began to break. Under pressure, he confessed. He admitted to holding Michaela under the water, saying he could no longer bear to live with a child he now knew was not his. He described confronting Shironda, accusing her of betrayal, and stabbing her when she begged for forgiveness. He spoke without visible emotion, recounting the acts with the detachment of someone who had already justified his actions in his own mind. For investigators, it was a chilling moment. A man long seen as a model father calmly outlining the murder of his own family. The case moved to trial in late 2024. Prosecutors presented the evidence methodically, the burner phone records showing staged calls, the internet searches documenting premeditation, the blood and drag marks at the dock, the zip ties and duct tape in the SUV, and most powerfully, Michaela's handwritten note. Jurors were told that the note proved both motive and state of mind. Reginald had been given the truth by his daughter, and rather than protect her, he turned that truth into the reason for her death. The defense attempted to argue that Reginald acted in the heat of betrayal, that his military background and stress had left him vulnerable to a sudden break. But the evidence of planning was overwhelming. Prosecutors reminded jurors that he booked the cabin deliberately, packed weapons and restraints, and created an alibi with surveillance footage. This was not a snap decision. It was a calculated act. In December 2024, after less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with related charges for evidence tampering and false reporting. At sentencing, the judge delivered a statement that cut to the heart of the case. You were entrusted to protect your wife and daughter. Instead, you committed the ultimate betrayal, extinguishing their lives and destroying your own in the process. Reginald Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the man revealed in court. Neighbors who had once admired his discipline now spoke in disbelief about the darkness that had been hidden in plain sight. For those closest to the family, the tragedy was unbearable. Shironda was remembered as a flawed but loving mother, while Michaela's teachers and friends described her as bright, honest, and brave. What lingers most in this case is not just the brutality of the murders, but the tragic role of a child who tried to do the right thing. Michaela's handwritten note was an act of courage, a 10-year-old's attempt to protect her father with the truth. Instead, it became the detail that sealed her fate. Her voice, captured on paper, remains the most haunting reminder of how quickly betrayal and rage can turn a family home into the setting of an irreversible crime.